Make a start. So hi everybody, thank you so much for joining our webinar today, all about cultural awareness and making sure that your learning content is truly inclusive. We're really excited to share such an interesting topic with you today, and thank you everybody who's joined us this morning. To kick things off, I would just like to introduce myself as well as our fantastic guest speaker, and also share with you the format of today's discussion. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Emily and I'm Head of Partnerships at Comtech Translations. I've been working in the translation industry for over 5 years now, and so far I've worked very closely with both L&D teams and e-learning and training agencies to support them with translation and localization. And that covers a whole range of global languages and subject areas, and I've been able to help them kind of navigate some of the challenges around language and culture. I'm delighted to be joined here today by our very special guest speaker, Jessica Rathke, who will be introducing herself very shortly. Jessica is part of our network of cultural awareness specialists delivering training and coaching in this field. And we've invited her to speak with us all today and just give you a little sneak peek into the Hofstede Insights cultural model and how considering all the different dimensions of culture as part of your learning and training strategy can bring a whole range of benefits. Just to give you a little bit of context before we get started as to why we as a translation partner consider this to be such an important topic. We work with a whole range of businesses across many different sectors who often share with us some of the challenges that they face around culture. That could be communicating with internal colleagues, it could be communicating with international clients, it could be learner engagement. And we recognise that learning and training content is an incredibly creative field. Storytelling is such a crucial part of learner experience, and often it can be a real challenge to kind of get that to land well in other languages and cultures. Typically, we tend to get involved once that English content has already been created and signed off, and it's now at a point ready to be translated and localized. But we've seen over the years that actually getting involved earlier in the process can really help that translation and localization stage. For example, it can identify elements that might have to be changed to be tailored for an international market, and it really kind of helps to make sure that the messaging is relevant for each target market and help you see better engagement and better ROI as well for you and your team and your clients as well. So we're really excited to welcome Jessica to talk to you about this exciting topic. If you've got any questions or observations throughout our webinar this morning, then please feel free to put them in the chat. I know that there'll be a few interactive elements as well for you to get involved in. And we'll also have a Q&A towards the end of the webinar as well. So we look forward to answering those questions then. So I will now hand over to you, Jessica.
Oh, thank you so much, Emily. It's great to be here, and thank you all for joining today. As my slide here suggests, I am associated with Hofstede Insights. It is one of the most well-known cross-cultural training and consulting companies in the world. I also help a company by the name of Cultural Consultants. It's a China-based company, and it's given me some great cross-cultural experience managing a sales team in China. And I've been helping them out for years. And I think, I got into the cross-cultural area quite late in my career, and I really wish I had done it sooner, because I'm finding that it really is a topic of tremendous interest now. And as Emily suggested, that it's really great to think about these cultural aspects before authoring actually begins, and is what we're doing actually appropriate for all the target markets that we're going into. Just a little more background about me. I do come from the language services industry, so I've had 30 years of experience in that industry and have worked together with Comtech in the past. I've worked quite extensively in the e-learning environment, so slightly earlier days than today, when it was quite new for e-learning to be localized into different languages. So I wanted to put that in context, because I do understand where you're coming from. And I've also had a lot of experience in the language services industry, providing sales, consulting, and training services. And I've trained people in over 45 countries. And actually, before we even started today, I was mentioning to Emily that it would have been so helpful for me to have done the cross-cultural first before delivering rather Anglo-based training to certain markets where they said, I don't think this is going to work here. So I'm going to combine some of that experience with some of my anecdotes, which I hope will be relevant to your companies. And again, please do ask questions. We do have a little bit of interactive things happening. I just kind of want to gauge, where we are with respect to culture. So without further ado, I'm going to make a start. I think, diversity and inclusion are hot topics these days, particularly in e-learning, in learning and training, and really in corporations and businesses all over the world. I think that the tendency is to think about it in terms of our own market, because the UK is such a multicultural country, and I know the majority of you are living in the UK. But I think it really goes well beyond that, because you're here because you're serving global markets. You're translating content into different languages. But I think as the demographics change in the UK, for example, but also the demographics in terms of the markets that you're going into, the markets that your clients are going into, that's only going to continue and broaden and widen. And as you'll see, some of the markets that companies are considering these days have a lot of cultural stretch from the UK, and the cultural aspects, I think, become even more important. So I think the need to adapt is going to increase. I think our need to adapt has been heavily influenced by what we're doing today, mainly influenced a lot by COVID, where so much has moved online. I think the online environment amplifies some of the differences, and it kind of tribalizes us a little bit. And also, just even in my own training, some of the things that I've done in live training that work really well don't work very well in an online environment. So there are different considerations for that. But, globalization by its very nature increases diversity. And I think we need, if we want to be successful in international markets, if we want to be successful with our international employees, then, we have to consider inclusion in a broader context. And different cultural groups learn differently. So let's start exploring that a little bit. First, by exploring you guys. So this is the first bit that's interactive. One of the cultures represented by one of these flags is being described in both these columns by two different countries. So I'll tell you, I'll go through all the flags just to be sure that we're aware of what countries we're talking about, but it's one of these flags or countries represented by the flag that is being described. So we have China, Mexico, Canada, Russia, Spain, Germany, Finland, France, the Netherlands, and of course the UK and the US. So this culture is being described by country A as being relaxed, friendly, uninhibited, emotional, and impulsive. Country B says this culture up here, one of these, is always in a hurry, serious and reserved, restrained and composed, and methodical, but it's only one culture being described. So who is it? Which country is being described here? Which one of these do you think? You can type your answers into the chat, please. Please answer. Sweden, okay. All of the above. Okay.
That's one way to make sure you get the answer right, isn't it?
Married to a Swede, okay, all right. Okay. Well, if nobody else is going to put their answer in there, we'll show you.
Very true, Richard. No one size fits all. You're 100% right.
Exactly. So the answer is the US, from a Japanese and a Mexican perspective. So the Japanese find us relaxed and uninhibited and quite emotional, I guess, and impulsive. That I can definitely see. My point of view from Mexicans is, I'm like, really? We're always in a hurry? Maybe. Serious and reserved? I guess. Restrained, composed, and methodical. So depending on what culture you come from, you have a different perception of other cultures. And I think this exemplifies quite distinctly how the US can be viewed very, very differently, or US culture or people. So let's explore that a little bit more. So where does culture come from? How do we learn culture? And how do we understand it? Dr. Hofstede, Professor Dr. Geert Hofstede, obviously founder of Hofstede Insights, he defines culture as the collective programming of the mind with which one group distinguishes itself from another. So what does that mean? Well, it means it means any number of things, but what it means is we learn culture like we learn everything else in life. When we're kids, we mimic our parents, we do what they do. We learn how to behave. We learn, what good and bad mean. If we're bad, we get reprimanded. If we're being good, we're praised. And so that behavior starts to become a part of ourselves. So how Hofstede came up with his 6 dimensions of culture that we're going to investigate today started with his work at IBM Corporation back in the 1960s. And he worked in HR. Well, he worked in various different roles in a global capacity. And at the time, IBM was one of the most global companies in the world, operating in about 40 countries. And there were about maybe, I can't remember the exact number, but let's round it up to say 350,000 employees globally. So he had this huge group of very international people. And he was observing as people from around the world were working together, sometimes there were miscommunications. Sometimes there was, well, in many cases, a lot of frustration. In some cases, there was actually outright hostility and complete just, I don't want to work with these people because they're difficult, for example. So he set about researching this very methodically. I won't go into all the theory and the background about that. You can read about Dr. Hofstede using Google. There's plenty of information about him. But he uncovered certain characteristics, or what he termed dimensions, that characterize different cultures. So we're going to take a more in-depth look at that. But first, we have to get just a little bit more kind of more of an overview so that we can kind of get a better idea when we dig deeper into this. So there are different levels of culture. And I like to think about this as kind of an onion. So we're kind of slicing this onion. And at the very core of our cultural levels, so to speak, are those things that I just kind of referred to before, like the difference between good and bad, or good and evil, the value systems we develop as cultures, and those things we feel very strongly about. Our values drive our behavior. And culturally, we can be very different in terms of the difference between right and wrong, good or evil, abnormal or normal, what's forbidden or permitted, or what's dangerous or safe. So our perceptions of these can be quite different around the world. And these behaviors, according to Hofstede, are pretty well set by the time we're in our early teens, say around about 13 years old. And they're very difficult to change once those are set. And I'm going to use myself as an example as we progress through the presentation, because I have definitely found that being the case for myself. So then let's move to another layer, the next layer of that onion, which is the rituals. These are very closely held things to our values, such as religion, for example, and the belief systems around religion. It's how we interact with one another, how we conduct meetings, how we communicate with the closest people in our lives. Again, very much driven by our value systems. The next layer would be our heroes. So these would be people who embody the cultural attributes, these things down here, but they exemplify them in our culture, that a lot of the things that we value. So it could be our parents, it could be relatives, it could be influential people in our society, such as politicians. So we have Obama and Putin representing quite different value systems. Could be sports figures. So I don't know, George Best or Novak Djokovic, since I'm in Wimbledon today. Very, they exemplify things that we hold very dear, but it's kind of just that next layer out. And then the outer layer, which is kind of my favorite in many ways, is all the fun stuff. These are the reasons why we travel abroad. These are the reasons why we like to experience different things, because it's the food. So we like to go to Italy and have real pizza or spaghetti. We go to different countries to see different kinds of art. We get a sense of humor, what's funny and not funny, how people dress, the kind of music people listen to, and then of course language. So language, of course, being a very distinct outward expression of cultural values. And I think Emily would agree with me, working in language services. I speak a couple of different languages, some better than others, but the way we express ourselves is very much value and culturally driven. So I wanted to give you kind of that high level overview of things before we delve into the deeper part of it. I'd like to kind of turn to, now that we've explored that, the 6 dimensions of the Hofstede cultural model. You can also think about this as kind of social dilemmas and how we interact with one another at various levels. So the cultural model, one of the first and most influential dimensions of the Hofstede model is the power distance index. So it's our relationship to power. And just briefly, it's kind of how comfortable are we ascribing power to someone else? Are we comfortable kind of letting someone else control things? Or are we very uncomfortable with that? We'll explore that in greater detail. Individualism versus collectivism. So this is pretty straightforward, I think, but it's the I versus the we in our culture. So my home culture, which you've no doubt discerned, is the United States. Our culture is very individualistic, as is the UK. Collectivist cultures such as China, for example, it's more about the we as a group. Masculinity versus femininity. It's our relationship to motivation. So it's being the best versus doing our best. And I know a few people have some trouble with this terminology. Remember, this came from the 1960s. Hofstede keeps thinking about what else we could call it, but we haven't come up with anything that works very well yet. The next dimension is called uncertainty avoidance. So how comfortable are we with uncertainty, or do we like to try to control things so that there are more certain outcomes to life, really? And then the last 2, now these first 4 were the foundation and the ones that Hofstede himself developed. The last 2 were developed by a fellow by the name of Minkoff, who is one of Hofstede's colleagues. And long-term orientation. So are we short-term oriented, like the US is a really good example of that? Or, are we much more long-term oriented? Do we really plan for the future rather than just living for today, so to speak? And then we have indulgence versus restraint. So our relationship to pleasure. So do we go out and buy the Lamborghini today on credit, or do we save for it? Right? And all of these dimensions, I have to also emphasize that since Hofstede and Minkoff developed these, they have been validated over 70 times since they were uncovered or created. And so even though they kind of, things shift, we know the world changes, people change, cultures change, but all of them seem to kind of change at the same pace, strangely enough. So over time, yes, our perceptions, our way of doing things changes, but it tends to move together. So it's important to realize that the the model has been validated over and over again over time. So we don't have time in a 1 hour webinar to go through every single thing. So I'm focusing on the 3 that I think impact learning to the greatest degree. So we're going to investigate these 3 dimensions in more detail. Whoops, sorry. I want you to think, before we kind of get into the detail also, is that there's this thing called cultural stretch. So if we look at this map, it kind of represents one element of cultural challenge to us. So every European country has at least one, some have more than one. And the cultural stretch, so yeah, UK, Ireland, we're very similar cultures. When we get to the Nordics, they're a little less similar, but pretty similar, but slightly challenging. And then as we get into the pink and we get into the orange and the red countries, things become increasingly more challenging. And I'll be curious to hear if you find this to be the case. I certainly have found that to be the case with many of the countries here. I've done business in almost all of them, frankly. If we take this to a global level, it even gets more challenging. Look at how much of the world is in the culturally most challenging box for our culture here in English-speaking markets or the UK. The only exceptions would be the US, Canada, English-speaking countries, generally very culturally similar, but the rest of the world tends to be quite a bit different.
And Richard's just made a great observation, actually, that yeah, this is the perspective of English-speaking markets primarily.
Yes, and I should thank you for pointing that out. I meant to say that at the beginning.
Yeah, and you're 100% right. If we're looking from a different culture, then these colors would look very different.
Well, absolutely. And these people in the countries that are designated red, it would be the other way. Well, it wouldn't be exactly the other way around, but I'm sure a lot of these countries find us quite difficult too. So now let's take a look at, I'd like to explore in more depth the impact of culture on learning. And there are 3 specific areas that I'm looking at. So learning preparation, learning delivery, and learning assessment, and how culture can influence or impact these. I also kind of created a small continuum here because, you know, in some cases, maybe translation is fine. That might be just fine for the Nordics. It's probably okay, probably. Then there might be elements though that, well, maybe certain things need to be changed. It might be some graphics, or it might be certain expressions, depending on what the learning is, or the topic or the subject is. Are there other assets or there methods that have to be changed? Which ones can be changed? Which ones require change? Which ones, you know, can kind of stay the same? Do we need to adjust everything? You know, maybe the teaching style is wrong. Maybe there are just certain cultural requirements that would require a revamp. I think that might be extreme, but in a few instances in my career, I've had a few things pointed out to me that kind of made me change a lot of things in terms of how I was delivering training to people. So I think this really can have an impact on inclusiveness. You know, all of these aspects, if we do them a bit wrong, we could end up with people like this. You know, it could seriously impact, you know, not just the idea of inclusion, but actually get in the way of the knowledge the person is supposed to come away knowing, right? And I can, you know, we've got frustration maybe up here. I can tell you a real quick example. I've done a lot of coursework in Germany, and I can tell you that because there is such an emphasis on theory as we'll learn, I just couldn't listen anymore. You know, I wanted to let's get busy, let's get into it. And my learning style is all about being practical, and I just was terribly frustrated. Boredom could also be a result. She certainly doesn't look engaged, and probably doesn't feel very included, whatever the cause may be. I think this comes down to Richard's point also too, to a certain extent, is we need to understand our own point of view of the world, because we view the world differently from other cultures. So, okay, I have some silly examples here, kind of, but I thought they were kind of cute. We have a groundhog, and who looks at the world very differently from a giraffe, especially with sunglasses on, but their perspective is quite different. And I thought that was really illustrative of how, do we really perceive our world, and how does somebody else perceive it? And that awareness, I think sometimes, yeah, we realize it when we travel to another country. Things feel different, things work differently, people are speaking a language we may or may not understand. But this again goes deeper into that, into those value systems. And I think my greatest shock to learn that, and you'll all laugh at this, but the US wasn't the center of the universe. I grew up in the US, kind of isolated from the rest of the world. I studied German, so I started learning about different cultures. My father traveled a lot, brought a lot of different people into our home, started learning about different cultures. But my perspective really didn't change until I went to study in Austria for 2 years. And, over time, yeah, there was the fun stuff. I love strudel. I love cafes. I like Austrian wine, all that stuff. But as time went by, I started getting really irritated with the way they did things there. I just thought some of the things were perfectly stupid, even though they really weren't. It's just different. And then after about 4 or 5 months and hearing their perspective on America, on the United States, and me developing more appreciation for the Austrian way of doing things, I started looking at my own country very differently. And, that self-assessment was really useful for me, because there were certain things I thought, well, actually, we do a lot of things that are really not very smart either. But I never thought to question it before. I'll give you some other examples more recently, but that one really stuck with me, and it's really influenced my perspective from the time I was 20 years old onward. So I think this exemplifies it. We don't know who discovered the ocean, but we're pretty sure it wasn't a fish. An Arab proverb. I was in my own little ocean. If I had jumped out into the sand, that would have been a big shock. If I jump into another pool of water, well, it's a different pool of water, but, and so I have to adjust to that. But we're just in our own environment, and many times we don't question it. Depends on how much we travel, I suppose, as kids and as adults, but that deep experience, I think, is something, that takes time to develop. Now let's take a look at the 3 different dimensions that I'd like to share with you and their impact on learning. So again, the power distance is all about inequalities in power. So the definition, the extent to which less powerful members of society accept that power is distributed unequally. So that makes me kind of uncomfortable. But let's look at a few examples here. So this continuum is part of the Hofstede model as it pertains to power distance and learning. And so what Hofstede did is he created a relatively easy way to interpret cultural differences. And so he created this scale of 0 to 100 and created a scoring system. I use score because it's not a score. It's not some better than others. It's a number assigned based on whether they're very low power distance or, more equal societies versus less equal societies or very high power distance. So I've picked 5 examples. I mean, the Hofstede model includes, 90 odd countries at this point. Too much to put in a slide. I have examples for each of these. So of course we have the UK and the US, Germany. We have Argentina, which is really an interesting example, and then China, based on some of my work with China. So Germany and the UK actually have a fairly low tolerance for power distance. I think we can see that in politics, what happened in the government just yesterday. People disagreeing with Boris Johnson and resigning from the government. That doesn't happen so much in China, as far as I know. But very interesting. And then the US, a little less comfortable, or a little more power distant, I should say. The difference, not so great. Argentina, a point differential of 9, you start to feel a little bit of a difference. And then, of course, China being very much more on the power distant plus side. And the way to, even though the numbers are kind of useful, it's most useful to look at the differential. So the spread between the US and China, or the UK and China, is pretty great. And so that's where some of the differences start to kind of butt up against one another. Oops, so let's take a little look at that. Inequality on the low power distance side is minimized where it's really expected on this side of the spectrum. We have low dependence on government. We have some dependence, but not a lot. We don't have dependence on other people. We really are, prefer to sort of make our own way. Here we would have much higher dependence, and that word obedience doesn't even occur over here. Equal rights for all, well, okay, it's a belief system. We strive for that. I'm not sure any country has achieved it yet, but we believe in equal rights. Whereas power holders, even an instructor in a learning situation, is very privileged and has the power. Information flow is fluid, where information flow can be selective, usually top down, and then maybe bottom up, but it goes through different channels. It may reach the top, it may not. Initiative is either encouraged or sanctioned. And control, we don't like control. None of us like to be controlled, I don't think, in the UK so much. Control here is expected, and it isn't a bad thing. It has to do with a lot of historical precedents in a country. I think for us also, we have laws that protect us, whereas in many countries around the world, the legal system is a little bit less helpful. And so, the power holder does have responsibility to make sure everyone is safe, for example. So looking at it in terms of learning preparation, I think this is the key here, is our presumption at the beginning, before we're ever in an e-learning or a training environment, is the instructor is a facilitator among equals. You'll see what I mean by that in a minute. Whereas the instructor has much higher status and is clearly above the attendees, an expert who's going to deliver information. It's more from that expert. Whereas from our side of the low power distance side, it's really instructions from experience, much more general, a lot less specific. So power distance in learning delivery and assessment, particularly in delivery, has a lot of aspects to it. So from my perspective, and this is generally how I would do a training, except with this delivery to my Chinese base, my Shanghai based sales team, I've had to learn to adapt my style tremendously in delivery. And it doesn't come naturally to me at all. I'm more the generalist, give a framework, you can talk, we have interaction, we collaborate, you can disagree with me. We have specific assignments, but, I'm expecting people to have open output, come up with ideas themselves. I'm not giving a lot of instruction and oversight. I'm kind of letting people get on with it unless they need me. And I can tell you with my Shanghai colleagues, all of this did not work. I would ask open-ended questions in emails, following up on training, and I would get no answers. I had to learn to become much more specific. So using that as an example. So I had to be much more thorough in preparation and deliver according to what my preparatory document said. I had to be a lot more directive. I had to provide a lot more guidance. I had to ask a lot more questions. I had to give a lot more direction. It doesn't mean it's bad, it's just different. And without adjusting my behavior, I was not getting, well, first of all, I was just not connecting with them at all. And second of all, I wasn't getting what I needed out of them. Giving them lots of additional information was really helpful so that they could read on their own and keep learning. And I'm presuming an e-learning online environment in this example. And then checking in to make sure that they're doing okay. Are they really acquiring the knowledge I need them to? And a lot of this I did one-on-one so that they would be more open about sharing maybe insecurities with me, never in front of the group. So again, on this side, the low power distance, we focus on the application of concepts rather than the mastery of the information. And so, I'm not really giving tests in this scenario per se, but I am looking for mastery of the information. And getting that mastery is so helpful to that group of people because then they can start applying it. But applying it before they truly master it is very uncomfortable. Whereas we'll just go out there and try anything, right? And they want to please me as the instructor as well. The other thing that's very interesting here, be really interested to hear from our participant from Taiwan as well, because he's much closer to that culture than I am. But I think also in this scenario, yeah, I really have to be just a lot more precise and responsible for these folks. So if they don't do well on an exam, a lot of that will be reflected on me as an instructor, as opposed to here, it's just that, well, they didn't get it. Maybe I didn't convey it well, but it's more of a two-way street there. Okay. I don't have an e-learning example per se or a training example per se of this, but I thought this was an interesting analogy that could kind of apply as an example for power distance. So this is really interesting. During COVID, Zoom was getting a lot of feedback from Japanese users that they couldn't figure out who was the leader of a meeting, for example, or the leader of it could be a training, or the manager of a group of people globally who may not know this person. And it's because in real life, seating arrangements are very important. And so people are seated according to their seniority or their power level. And so Zoom ended up creating a new interface for Japanese business people so that they could tell who the leader was or who was the most senior person in the room, because of the protocols and those value systems that they have in terms of how one conducts oneself in that environment. So I thought that was really interesting, that can really have an impact. And people just didn't know what to do. So meetings and learnings were just not very effective. Okay, let's move on. I'm just going to do a time check for myself. Uncertainty avoidance. So dealing with the unknown. So this defined the extent to which people feel threatened by ambiguous situations and have created beliefs and institutions to try to avoid these. So again, we have our continuum. Flags move around a little bit. So on the uncertainty avoidance, China's a little bit of an outlier on this, I would say, for a whole bunch of reasons I can't get into today. But uncertainty avoidance, okay, this is a bit of a difference between the US and Britain. Germany, it starts to get pretty noticeable, and certainly for Argentina, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. I think uncertainty in learning, these are big generalizations, and there is some overlap with some of the other dimensions. But again, it's all about, there isn't so much structure discussions and brainstorming as opposed to lecture and structure in detail. Practical application rather than theory first. So theory first creates that certainty as opposed to just jumping in and seeing how things go. So very generalist, where here it's all about that expertise. So in terms of delivery, in terms of learning preparation, I think this stood out for me the most, is that on the high side, so, and I, especially with Argentina and to a certain extent Germany, providing details in advance, so everybody knows what's going on, and learning what the learning process is going to be. How are we going to do things? What am I supposed to do? What's the structure? Theoretical background information. So, you know, we want the expert. We want to learn from the expert. So professor, doctor, whoever, for example, in Germany. Detailed instructor credentials, assessment criteria. How are we going to be judged? And what are the very specific outcomes that we're going to achieve? Versus, and China, again, I'm not going to focus on so much for this. Overview of goals and outcomes. We don't want like a 20-page document describing the course. I know I probably would skim it, but I probably wouldn't read it thoroughly. Practical application of concepts. Yeah, we want somebody who has that practical application. So it could be, I don't know if it's sales training that I deliver, you know, people in our part of the world would want to know that I've actually done sales before. You know, I'm not the theoretical sales expert. I know the theory, but it's applying it. Yeah, you know, okay, a little bit of an assessment. How are we going to be judged? But I want to come away knowing how to do it rather than, you know, understanding the background of it. I just want to start doing it. Delivery and assessment. So I think the big thing is this one is deductive reasoning. So there's, you know, kind of a process here, you know, in introducing the topic, building the argument, addressing concerns, then we can have counter arguments, you know, conclusion and action. And it's a little messier over here. We do the general principle and we start to practical application, and then the arguments and the discussion, you know, kind of happen throughout. Here again, why, not how, and here is how, not why. So applications versus principle. So again, tests requiring mastery, learning more verbatim and precise answers. So that kind of crosses over a little bit with power distance, but for different reasons. This is all about that certainty. Oh, I passed the test. I know the theory. I get it. And here it's all about, well, you know, I need to know how to do it. So I'm just going to keep trying until I get it right. And very open output. It could be different for all kinds of different things. And, you know, a couple of experiences with Argentina. I have to say, I wish I had done it differently when I was delivering sales training, and also a training course in getting project managers and salespeople to communicate better. The project management team in particular, because they were less accustomed to dealing with Americans like me, really gave me a lot of grief. They were just like, this just doesn't mean anything to us, because I didn't do enough pre-planning and enable them to understand what the parameters of the course were and how we were going to go through everything. So that uncertainty really made them uncomfortable, and they pretty much didn't participate. And I'll tell you one more story about that for another reason they didn't participate when we get to the next dimension. But first, quick little quiz, I guess. Don't know what else to call it. Exercise. Okay, what's this guy doing? You know, we're looking at how it can impact our world. So here's this guy. What's he doing? What do you think? What's the situation? Describe what you see. Just a couple of things maybe that you could put in the chat. What's he doing? What kind of day has he had? Who is he? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Yeah, chilling, relaxing. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that is very much our view. He's a successful guy having some downtime. He's got, laptop there. He's dressed pretty nicely. He's got some time to himself, having a beer. What else would you do? Well, people from India would do something very different and think very differently. And if one of my co-trainers, a lady by the name of Kirsty, she actually delivered this to this little quiz to a group of Indian folks. And basically they were like, oh my God, I'll go have this poor man. Where is he? He doesn't have any friends to have a beer with. So, they viewed him as pretty unsuccessful, obviously has money, but gosh, no friends. So this is that's the intro kind of to the final dimension, which is individualism. So how we relate to a group. So in our culture, US as well, people look after themselves and they're usually their immediate family, maybe some other family members and maybe special friends. But we're pretty much, we're on our own. We're very individual people. Collectivist societies are comprised of groups of people who look after one another. They take care of each other. And it's a very different perspective. And this is something I experienced also with the Argentinians and definitely with my folks from China. So again, the continuum, US and the UK are the most individualistic countries in the world. China isn't the most collectivist. Actually, Russia would be slightly even less individualistic. Very interesting. And then we have kind of Germany and Argentina towards the middle of both sides of the spectrum. Very quickly, it's we versus I. Relationship before task. So in business or in learning, it's important to have a relationship before we actually do. Whereas, we just kind of do in our culture. And then if we're successful, the relationship follows. So usually in business, we do the task and then we develop a relationship. But here it's exactly the opposite. Harmony versus freedom. We know that the term loss of face. So if I do something wrong within my group, I'm actually not just hurting myself, but I hurt the group. So that's the idea of shame. So I impact all those other people. Whereas here it's more guilt because that's more self-oriented. So I lose respect for myself if I do something bad. Implicit communication. So again, the group I'm training in China, if they don't like something, they just don't say anything. So silence is a big, useful tool. Whereas if somebody doesn't like what I'm doing in the UK, they'll tell me. And usually pretty straightforwardly, this is, I don't like this. This is stupid. This is silly. I need a different example. It's just completely different. Really quickly, I know we're getting kind of short on time here. But this is from a learning experience that I had with my Argentinian group, and I found this graphic online. And this would be pretty much the British, although the British sometimes say the opposite of what they mean. I get that, but it's still direct. You just have to understand the nuance a little bit. But we go from A to B. Pretty straightforward. Words, we communicate with words. The words have a lot of meaning. Argentinian, well, we do a lot of words, but we are also building a relationship and we're kind of spending a lot of time getting to the end result. And with that same group, the project management group, the leader of that group felt also that I was not really considering the we, and that I was not considering his group. So he's quite protective of his group. And he's like, and this happened with a client of his as well that I was also working with. It was exactly the same thing. He's like, all you do is tell me this is what's happening. You've taken no time to get to know me. I don't know who you are. I don't know what your objectives are. I don't know if I can trust you. And he said this to me one-on-one, and I was like, oh, wow. Okay, let's schedule a meeting and we'll spend an hour to get to know each other. So, we were kind of here. We had that hour conversation. I gave him more information about my background and what I was really trying to achieve for both sides of the sales and the project managers. And through that conversation, he was like, oh, okay, well, that would have been really helpful for us to know. I'll convey that to the team, and I want you to have a team meeting too, so they can get to know you, the group, the we. So, I learned a huge lesson there. And then I had to intervene with their client because they were like this, worse than the two of us. It was hostile. And I had to step in and I used the slide on both sides so they could understand what was going on.
Richard has just put in the chat, he finds it a bit sad that the UK and the US are so individualistic.
Do I find it sad? Wow, I don't know. We could get into a whole political discussion too. Kind of, in some ways, it could be viewed as that. Let me think about that while I finish. I'm going to let that, I'm going to noodle on that and hopefully have something more intelligent to say when we're done. So again, the group versus individual, I should have built a relationship, and that's very important for the Chinese folks too. And even though I know this, I still get it wrong sometimes because we have that default. I've been American. I was trained to be American, and it's embedded in me from the time I was 13, 14 years old. And I really have to consciously go, I need to build a relationship. I need to spend time. Group exercises are very important. Explaining the bigger picture, showing how it all fits together. Also, that was what Argentina was asking me to do. Then I got action, but I didn't get action until I explained that. And the outcomes are more group oriented. So that's why I had to get involved with his group, and why I have to view the sales team in China from a group perspective. Individual is something different, which you'll see in a second. Again, we do brief, introduction, overview of format, what everybody's supposed to do. We do brainstorming, but it's my outcome. However I apply it is kind of my outcome. Yes, I need to know information, but it's individual outcomes. It's not a group outcome. So in terms of delivery and assessment, this I've learned, I never get challenged in front of other people. I get challenged one-on-one, but not in front of other people. Usually with tasks, one person will speak on behalf of the group. This has been a new thing that I've been trying to work on with the sales team in China, and it really does. It does help because they can arrive at kind of a consensus on things, and then one person can deliver, but on behalf of that group. Again, that's what I mean by consensus assessments. And any feedback is indirect. Anything, more direct is going to be one-on-one, always one-on-one, never in front of other people, especially if it's negative. In Germany, my course assessment was presented in front of the class by a professor once. I wish I had had a higher grade than a B-. It was terribly embarrassing, and I was really mad because they're just that bit more, it's okay in front of other people. They're individualistic, but I would have preferred this. But we can challenge. Again, tasks, brainstorming is a big thing. We each bring our own opinions and disagree and talk, and the individual is really the focus. Assignments are generally, even if we have group assignments, it's still, the outcome still ends up being an individual one. And very direct feedback. So my German guy gave me very, very direct feedback. Last thing, I know
Jessica, we've got a couple of minutes left. So
okay, I'll stop. I won't even, this you can kind of take a look at, direct versus indirect. Silence is a big thing. in indirect cultures, we can miss a lot. It's best to clarify always. And I've just got summary slides, which I'll just skip over, and because I want to give you time to ask questions and have conversation. So my conclusion is, I think if we understand culture better, we can achieve better inclusion and learning outcomes. That's the whole point. And there are some things. One thing I'll mention here, I'll let you read the rest. These are just some of the services that are available to you. I would strongly suggest the Culture Compass for your individual cross-cultural, I don't want to say competence, but I'll say competence. So what you can do is compare yourself being British or Taiwanese or whatever, and you pick 3 other cultures to compare yourself to based on some questions that you answer. And I would suggest that you pick at least 2 that you have difficulties with or perceived difficulties with, and 1 that's kind of similar or that you kind of feel comfortable with. And then you get about a 20-page report on this that you can read. It's about 35 euros for that compass. It's inexpensive. And I found it very interesting. It was very enlightening about some of my cultural bias. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I will stop now and let you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. While everybody's thinking, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat. We'll just move over on to the next slide so that you can see our contact details. If you do have any questions about the cultural awareness service, the ways that we can both support you in kind of helping you communicate better with international colleagues or clients, or if you do want any kind of cultural advice, then we are the people to get in touch with. So we've popped our details here. I would definitely recommend the Cultural Compass. It was really eye-opening for me. My power distance index is actually much higher than the standard British person, which I found fascinating. So it just shows how even within a culture we can be quite different.
Right. And I just want to say I didn't put my details here on purpose because this is a Comtech sponsored thing. It's better that you get in touch with Emily first, especially since most of you know her already. But if you have, specific questions, I'm more than happy to be copied in, and I can answer those after the fact. But for now, if there's anything you really want to know, and I get it, you weren't trying to be political on being individualistic, but it does impact our politics tremendously just by what's happening right now.
Richard's put another comment as well about sort of the contextualization, so not only just sort of word translations, but also imagery, procedures and things like that, making them culturally relevant as well, which is a fantastic point.
Yeah, especially for those countries that are quite a bit different from us. And, the greater the value system difference, I think that tells us a lot about how much adaptation probably has to take place.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions before we wrap up for today? Anyone want to pose any questions to Jessica? No. I don't think anything's coming through on the chat, so I think that's us for today. Thank you everybody for joining us this morning, and yeah, if you've got any questions after the fact, then please just let us know, and we'll be in touch with a recording of the webinar and any additional materials as well for you. So thank you all very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, thank you everyone very much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.